welcome back to the Moldex3D Advanced Tips and Tricks. My name is Alex Baker, and today we're going to be going over an advanced CADdoctor tutorial. In this lesson, you can expect to learn more about the tips and tricks for improving your model quality using CADdoctor, the utilization of advanced functions beyond the normal procedure, and the removal of unnecessary features using CADdoctor. As far as CADdoctor is concerned, the main procedure consists of 5 buttons. So let's go ahead and actually just open up CADdoctor so that we can just review real quick, or maybe for those that haven't used CADdoctor in a little while, we can actually just jump straight into CADdoctor, and we're just going to open it up as a standalone. I know a lot of users actually go through the Studio interface to open up CADdoctor, but it is its own standalone program. So we always like to actually use CADdoctor as its own program so that we can get a saved model or a kind of like a modified step file out of CADdoctor. And that'll just kind of give us an intermediate starting point for Studio. Whereas if you go through Studio, you don't actually have that option. It just kind of interrelates back and forth between CADdoctor and Studio. All right, so we all know that the main procedure is import, and then check, auto stitch, auto heal, and then export. So those are the 5 main buttons that we click when it comes to CADdoctor. But we're going to dive a little bit deeper with a more complex model that has some more errors than probably you're used to. There's 3 files here. We're actually going to go in and fix all 3. We're going to start with CADdoctor 1. And we're obviously just going to go through them one by one here. So we're going to start with CADdoctor 1. We'll go back to the CADdoctor interface. We'll use the import function just because that's what we usually use. All right, and a lot of you probably already know what this model looks like. We're just going to kind of review the main procedure really quick, and then we're going to dive into a couple more complex models where we're actually going to get very far into some of the more advanced functions. So just as a reminder, so we have this model here. We can go and check our geometry here. All right, and again, for those that may not know, the check function actually runs a 16-step checking process that identifies and categorizes all of the different types of errors that could be possible. Now, these aren't always necessarily errors in the CAD design. It could actually just be an error in the translation between your CAD system and Moldex3D. So it's very important to kind of keep an open mind as to what's actually being identified here. It could actually just be in the translation process, maybe even in the exporting process from your CAD system. These errors could have manifested themselves. All right, so there are 3 different types of severities. We have critical, which is any error that really is going to cause us issues. So we really want to get rid of these critical errors if at all possible. Serious errors, we want to get rid of these if at all possible. Sometimes they're a little bit more difficult to get rid of. So if we can't get rid of them, then we might have to just deal with them in the meshing if they cause any issues. But the whole purpose of CADdoctor here is to kind of make your life as easy as possible. We don't want to be spending a whole lot of time in CADdoctor. So if anything's really overly difficult to fix, then maybe we want to just bypass it and see if it causes issues in the actual meshing of the part. And then minor errors, the ones here at the bottom, we don't really deal with these too much. They're just kind of listed as unimportant. They're more of just a notification or just identifying some spots that are weird, but not necessarily problematic. All right, so what we're going to do is, so we've imported, we've checked. The 3rd button here would be auto stitch. So the auto stitch will allow us to fix one of 2 types of errors, or one of 2 types of problems that are listed under the loop of free edges error. So obviously in this part, we don't have any loops of free edges, which is why the AutoStitch tool is currently grayed out. But the loop of free edges will occur under 2 scenarios. The first one, and by far the most common, is when 2 surfaces become disjointed or disconnected from one another. This is almost always a result of a tolerancing difference between your CAD system and Moldex. So the connection between surfaces happens within a very small space. And if that small space, which is okay in your CAD system, but not okay in Moldex3D, if that small space becomes disjointed, then you actually end up getting a loop of free edges. And that's what this AutoStitch tool is actually used for. It's used to say, okay, well, the tolerances that we're using by default are not exactly what the CAD system was using. Let's use a different tolerance. So that's exactly what this tool does. It allows you to input a new tolerance and tries to connect all of the loops of free edges within that tolerance. The second type of error that occurs here is when a surface is just completely missing. You can think of it like a hole in the geometry. And in that case, we just have to replace the surface completely. And just a bit of foreshadowing, we will be dealing with that later on. So that's why this AutoStitch function is grayed out right now, is because we don't actually have any translational errors or any missing surfaces or anything like that. So what I'll ask everybody to do is just go ahead and auto heal. Auto heal will just attempt to fix everything else without modifying the geometry. So it'll just maybe modify the connection between surfaces. Sometimes it'll just merge some smaller surfaces with larger ones just to make the data a little bit less. It'll make the meshing a little bit smoother. There's a lot of things that it does, but more importantly, there are things that it doesn't do, and that's modify the geometry. So if you have a contoured surface, or if you have a fillet or a logo or something like that, CADdoctor, I shouldn't say logo because sometimes the logos can be a little bit weird, but I'll say for the vast majority of the time, CADdoctor won't make any major modifications to your geometry. And that's why it always kind of leaves some errors at the end. It's not necessarily saying that those are unfixable. It's just that those errors, if we were to fix those errors, it would actually cause CADdoctor, or it would cause the geometry to change. So it's just asking you to do those manually. In this case, we're lucky enough to just have some minor errors left over. Like I said, we don't really care too much about minor errors. Sometimes, you can go into actually fix all these minor errors. If you highlight any of them, you'll see down here towards the bottom that there are some repair tools, which, again, we'll be getting into those a little bit later. But for minor errors, usually they're not worth the time to spend on fixing them, so we just kind of leave them alone and take note that they're there. Now, before we jump out of this model, there's actually a really awesome tool of CADdoctor that almost never gets utilized, mostly because it's not very obvious that it's even in CADdoctor. And it's called our Simplification tool. So Simplification essentially means that we're going to take our geometry, and because we're just running this in simulation, we can actually get rid of some of the minor features on our part, namely things like these small fillets, small chamfers, logos, even like small like holes and stuff. Maybe they were just created in the translation, or maybe they just weren't. Especially for compression molding, most of the time holes are kind of a secondary process. So those can be removed in CADdoctor as well. So we're going to jump into the simplification version of CADdoctor and show you guys how exactly that works and what our geometry looks like after a simplification would be done here. So I'm going to ask everybody to go up to where it says PDQ, and that's going to be right above your error table, or your error list, I guess, if you want to call it that. There's a PDQ standing for Part Design Quality. I'm going to ask you to click on that drop down. We're going to go to simplification mode. You can see how non-obvious this is. You'd have to search quite a bit to even find this. But simplification, just as the name suggests, is essentially just simplifying our model. We're taking out the complexities that would cause the meshing to go awry. So we're just trying to make our geometry as simple as possible without modifying the flow pattern. And that's one of the most critical philosophies when it comes to the simplification, is any modification that we make should only be, well, I guess any modification that we attempt to make should only be done if that is not going to impact the actual simulation. So it's actually very misconceived that these fillets cause a flow disruption. A lot of people have a lot of resistance to removing these fillets as they think that the flow pattern changes, and that's mildly true. Obviously, if we were to remove this fillet, we'd be bringing it to a corner, which means we're adding some sort of volume here. But from what we've seen, we've done a lot of studies on this, and the results just don't change. So you can remove these fillets up to a certain point. You know, once these fillets start to open up, something like this guy here, this fillet will actually cause a flow profile change, because we not only is the fillet large, it's also on a region of the geometry where the flow is changing direction. So that's extremely important to kind of note that and make sure that we keep these larger fillets and larger geometries so that we don't impact the actual flow. All right, so what do we do first? We actually have to select which feature or which type of feature we want to remove. In this case, I don't really have much small features other than fillets, maybe some chamfers, but we're just going to look at fillets for the time being. If you have a geometry you want to throw in here, you can certainly do so. If you want to test out the logo removal tool, it's actually very, very intriguing to use it. So I'm going to go to fillet, and I'm simply just going to check in the threshold from 0 to 10 millimeters. So what this means is it's going to check, actually you can right click, modify threshold to see what that actually means. So it's looking for a maximum radius of 10 millimeters and a minimum radius of 0 millimeters. So any fillet within that tolerance is going to be highlighted, and we can always modify this later, and we can kind of squeeze down that tolerance if we want to make sure that we're only removing the small fillets. But I always like to just start out with the default. So I'm just going to go ahead and highlight that, and then I'm going to go ahead and click check. And this check function is in the same spot as we had it back in PDQ. All right, so it's actually highlighted every fillet that we have in this salmon color. You'll actually see any connection between fillets is highlighted in white. So you can actually, you actually get that sort of visual tool as well. But you can see here that it's highlighted obviously all the small fillets, but it's also highlighted some of the larger fillets. So I can actually go in and measure this if I wanted to. I can probably go into my CAD system and do it a little bit easier. We do have a measurement tool. It's under check. I'm sorry. It's under analysis. There we go. And then there's a measure tool under here somewhere. Distance. There we go. So you can actually measure the distance if you want to. But most of the time it's easier to just go through this in like a trial and error type approach. So I can actually highlight fillet, right click, modify threshold, and I'll take this down to, let's say, 2 millimeters. We'll go maybe a little bit smaller than we might need, but we want to make sure that these bigger fillets are kind of removed if we can do it automatically, and that's what this function allows us to do. All right, so I'm going to press check one more time. Now that I've modified my threshold, you can see it right here. It's 0 to 2 millimeters. I'm going to press check. All right, so you can see that some of these fillets have been taken out from the selection, especially some of the ones on the bottom as well. And we're left with pretty much only the small fillets, with the exception of this guy right here, which I mentioned was actually quite impactful or quite important to the simulation. So this guy, we're actually going to have to go in and probably manually deselect this, and the reason for that is because this fillet tapers. You can actually see that it starts at kind of a large radius, but then it tapers all the way down to this smaller radius. Now this guy down here, this would be fine to remove because it's quite tiny, but this guy up here, this is way too large. So what I would recommend in this case is probably just remove the entire fillet from the selection. Otherwise, this, if we were to remove this, or I'm sorry, if we were to move these down here and keep this, you'd actually have a very quick reduction in radius, and that can actually cause some geometric issues when it comes to meshing. So what I recommend to do is whenever you have a fillet like this where it tapers down, just remove the entire fillet from the selection here. All right, so how do we do that? So there's actually a button right next to the check function. There is a button called check uncheck fillet. And now it's asking us to pick an object or select a region. So if I hover over my surface, you can see that it highlights in kind of a light blue. And when I left click on it, you can see that it changes to a dark blue or like a purplish color. So that just means that it is currently selected. And if I want to make multiple selections, I can either right click on this surface or I can hold the shift button. And for anybody that uses the studio interface, you'll know that the multi-selection is done with the shift button. So it's usually just a little bit more streamlined if you use the shift button, but like I said, the right click does work as well in CADdoctor alone. All right, so we have all of this fillet all the way down to the bottom here selected. And when I press the green check mark, you'll simply see, well, it'll come up with a confirmation asking me if I really want to delete this recognition as a fillet. And I'll just click apply to all places. There's no need to go through this 4 times. We know which surfaces that we've selected. So I can just check the apply to all places and click yes. And we see that that fillet is now deselected. All right, so a lot of cool things that you can do with this function. You have full control over what fillets get removed. And even after the removal process, which we're going to do in just a moment, even after the removal process, you can actually just undo it. And maybe if something got removed or maybe something got modified unnecessarily or unexpectedly, then you can go back and do that selection again. So maybe not intuitive, but very easy to use, I would say, once you know exactly how it works. Now, as far as removing these fillets, we have 2 options. We can either remove them all, or we can remove them one by one. So the first function here allows me to remove every one of them. So all 92 that have been selected will be removed. And then the other function here will just remove the selected fillet, which some of you might have noticed that this guy here is highlighted in kind of a dark red color. That means that it is currently selected. So we would only remove the selected fillet if we use the second tool. But in this case, I'm just going to remove them all because I don't feel like clicking on this button 92 times, mostly for that reason. So we're just going to go ahead and click the remove all function. And it'll just go through and remove them. It'll also recheck all of the errors that are coming out of CADdoctor as well. All right, so we can see that simplification coming through. And you can see that it's now not selected any fillets in the 0 to 2 millimeter threshold, which means that all of the unnecessary fillets have been removed automatically. So essentially what it does is it just reconstructs the area around that fillet and extends those surfaces out until they touch one another, truncates them, and yeah, that's essentially all it is. It's actually quite a simple function. That's why it doesn't take that long. But it is very powerful in the fact that you're not creating all these small elements on the fillets. These small elements obviously lead to a higher element count, which lead to longer simulation time. And that's really the main reason that we like to get rid of them. It's not necessarily just because they're a nuisance. There is a practical reason in that the simulation time will be reduced because the element count will be reduced. And that is definitely worth considering. So that's the simplification tool. Obviously, there's a lot of different features that we can remove, things like logos. If you scroll down a little bit, you have chamfers, round holes for compression molding. There's a lot of cool stuff that you can remove if as long as it's not going to impact the simulation. Getting rid of it is more than likely a good thing for you. But yeah, that's the only thing to consider. You just want to make sure that it's not going to impact the simulation at all. All right, so that's pretty much all I have with this geometry. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next geometry so that we can run through the process of actually going in and manually fixing some of these errors. But other than that, I'm just going to ask everybody to close out of CADdoctor. And you can save this if you want to. And I'm just going to go ahead and reopen CADdoctor here. All right, and once you have that open, you can go ahead and open up the CADdoctor 2 model. All right, so we're going to go ahead and import. I'm going to take CADdoctor 2. If I'm not mistaken, this one's a little bit more complex. Yeah, there we go. Got some interesting surfaces on here. You can actually see that a lot of these surfaces kind of, just from the top side, they look kind of weird. Um, but you know what? Before we do anything in here, before we judge this part too much, let's just go ahead and run through the process. So the first thing here is the check function. All right, again, looking for all those different types of errors. All right. And interestingly enough, you can actually see that we do have quite a few loops of free edges. And most of them you can see are pretty much just right on the surface connections. So this kind of error right here is what I was mentioning before, where you have a tolerance difference between your CAD system and Moldex. And if I zoom in really far, we can actually see that those surfaces are in fact actually disconnected from one another. The more you zoom in, the more apparent it becomes. But we will have to end up fixing those, and that's the first thing we're going to do. I actually see a lot of users just go like check and then auto heal, and then they like, oh, we have a loop of free edges, we should probably try to auto stitch that. So they actually go from check to auto heal back to auto stitch. And these buttons are in this orientation for a reason. The auto stitch can cause errors. So if I stitch two surfaces together, it may move the surfaces, and that may actually end up causing some other errors to reflect. So we always want to make sure that we're using this Autostitch tool before the auto heal tool to make sure that those errors are cleared as we go through this process. So the first thing we're going to do is auto stitch. And the AutoStitch tool is actually quite simple. So it says before the AutoStitch, we have 659 free edges. Now you'll note that that actually does not align with the number that shows up for loop of free edges. So loop of free edges only indicates how many groups of edges are available. So for example, if I have two surfaces that are disconnected like this, then I probably have about 2 free edges on one loop of free edge. So you can see that this is almost double the loop of free edges. And that is almost always going to be the case. So it says before we have 659, this is a number that we want to remember, and that'll make sense in just a moment. The tolerance we're going to use is basically, we're just basically modifying the tolerance that we're initially using between between your CAD system and Moldex3D. We're basically just increasing that tolerance so that we can merge these surfaces without too much of an issue. So I'm actually just going to use the default tolerance. Most of the time, the default tolerance is fine. You can click try, and we can actually see that that stitch actually fixed all of the free edges. So there was actually no problems there. If I continued to have free edges, you can see after auto stitch it says my free edges is 0. If this number was non-zero, then I may want to increase my tolerance a little bit. The highest I will ever go in this function is 0.25 millimeters. Once you get past 0.25 millimeters, then you start running the risk of merging different surfaces with one another. So I might actually, if I have 2 free edges here on either side of this small skinny surface, I might actually run the risk of merging this surface with this surface. And that's something we certainly don't want to do, because then this surface would just be kind of overlapping and it causes additional problems that we don't want to really deal with. So it's recommended to not go any higher than 0.25. If you have anything higher than 0.25, then you may have to go into the manual stitch function, which we'll see in just a moment. So if you want to, if you were to increase the tolerance, you would click retry. This number would update. But because we have a 0 number here, we can just go ahead and click fix, and it'll actually merge all of those edges together. And then it'll actually click that check button for us again. So we don't actually have to, you don't click auto stitch and then go into the check function. You just go check, auto stitch, and then straight to auto heal. You don't have to go back and press check again. You can see that we have in fact fixed all of our loops of free edges, and that middle button here is grayed out now. All right, so now we're just going to go ahead and simply auto heal this. All right, and then obviously that auto heal runs the check function once again. Now we can see in this case the geometry is now flawless. Is exactly what we want to see. All right, now I do want to take this through simplification one more time. And this geometry is actually quite similar to the other geometry, but there is one other thing that I want to point out as far as the process is concerned for importing this geometry and fixing it and then ultimately exporting it. So let's go back to that simplification menu. Note that I'll always do the simplification after I've done the auto heal. And the reason I do that is so that if any errors are created during the simplification process, then I can actually go back to the PDQ menu and check to see if there are any errors. And that's something that we're going to do with this model and something that you should do with every model. All right, so with this guy, there are only fillets, so I'm just going to go ahead and highlight fillet, and we're going to check. We'll see what is highlighted. Okay, so a majority of the part is highlighted, so we definitely don't want to use this this threshold. You can see that a lot of these major fillets, or a lot of these major features, I shouldn't even say they're fillets, they're just features on the part. We definitely don't want to get rid of those. So we're going to go and modify the tolerance. We'll take it down to 2, like I did last time. Okay. And then we'll check. Okay, so there are still some major fillets here, so maybe I go a little bit lower. We see that pretty much all of the smaller stuff is selected as we would expect. So we pretty much just want to go a little bit lower with our fillet radius. So maybe we go down to 1 here. All right, so now we can see that it's kind of lost these guys here. It's lost this guy and probably lost the ones on the bottom side here. Yep, so it's lost these guys on the bottom. So that's great. So that's all of the minor fillets on the part, stuff that's just going to cause our element count to be higher than necessary. So let's go ahead and just remove them all. Again, you can certainly go through and remove them one by one if you want to, but like I said, it's not always necessary. You can see it just like slightly adjust there just to get rid of all the fillets. So very cool. Gets rid of everything pretty much automatically. But let's go ahead and see if that's actually caused any disruptions on the part geometry itself. That's actually something that we always want to do, but we always like to go back through the PDQ menu just to make sure that we haven't introduced any new errors in this simplification process. So I'm going to go back to the PDQ menu, and I'm going to click check. We'll see if anything has been created. And in fact, we already see that some errors are in fact created. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the auto heal again. Most of the time the auto heal will just clear these up. Okay, so we have some sharp face angles, and we have a couple of serious errors for embedded faces. Let's take a look at where that is. So it actually looks like we have 2 surfaces that are kind of intersecting one another. There's like this little skinny surface, and this surface here has just kind of overlapped it a little bit. So if we can actually go through and fix this error, you can see that when I highlight the embedded faces, there's a repair tool down here, and it's just simply remove duplicate face. All right, and I just have to go in and select which duplicate face I want to remove. All right, and I probably want to get rid of that really skinny one, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit further. All right, so what I'm going to do in this case is actually, since that skinny one isn't highlighting, this actually happens quite often. I wouldn't say quite often, but it's really difficult to select these really skinny surfaces. So instead, I'm just going to get rid of the bigger surface. And the nice thing about CADdoctor, and this is something you're going to have to build confidence with, CADdoctor is actually really good at reconstructing the original surface that was there. So it's actually going to keep a memory of this surface. And when I go to actually fill this hole back in, or fill the geometry back in, it's going to remember that there was a certain contour, a certain curvature, and it's going to apply that to the new surface. So I'll just say yes. And now we can actually see that there's a loop of free edges that's been created. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to delete the skinny surface, because this is actually what was causing us so much trouble at the beginning. So you can see that it kind of like tapers down, just really skinny, and it's going to cause a lot of weird elements to occur. The way to just simply delete surfaces, we actually have this tool up here, delete. We also have it down here in the repair tool section, and it's the big red X here, delete. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit that function. I'm going to find this surface, the little skinny one, highlight it in that dark blue color, and then I'll press enter. And you'll see that that is simply just now removed. Now I'm also going to do that on the other side as well. It looks like maybe when we remove this fillet, it kind of left a remnant of that fillet behind, or maybe it overlapped the two. So we're just going to zoom in, highlight the surface, and then press enter, and it should remove that without issue. All right, but that's enough. Just those two skinny surfaces, we're just going to get rid of those, and then I'll exit out of the function by simply clicking the red X up here at the top right corner of the screen. All right, now we're left with a hole on our geometry. So this is the second instance where a loop of free edges will show up when we have a completely missing surface. And the nice thing is we have actually a fill hole function in CADdoctor. So a lot of you might already be familiar with the fill hole function for meshing. CADdoctor also has this sort of function for surfacing on the 3D model, which is really nice. So let's go and click fill hole, and we'll see that it simply just creates that surface for us. And we can see that if we rotate around enough, we'll see that that surface actually does have the contour that we originally had. So very nice function, very convenient, and it's very easy to actually go in and make these modifications. If our simplification tool wasn't helpful enough, we can actually go in and manually make these adjustments. So that's pretty much it though. Once you've made those adjustments, you can maybe just go in and check auto heal again if you really want to, but luckily this table kind of updates as you fix these errors. And now we're only left with a couple minor errors. And at this point, I would just go and export my model so that I can move on with my meshing. Let's go ahead and click File, New. You remember last time I just told you to exit out of CADdoctor and then reopen it. We have a quicker way to do that. If you want to just rapid fire models into CADdoctor, you can certainly do so. You just click New here. It'll ask me if I want to save. You certainly can. I'm not going to. All right, and once the new one opens here, we can go ahead and click Import, and we'll take CADdoctor 3. All right, so once you have this geometry in the interface, actually, on the surface, and this is the case for almost every model that you bring into CADdoctor, on the surface doesn't really look like there's a whole lot of problems, but it's not until you actually press the check button where everything starts to become highlighted. And in this case, it is actually a very clean model, with the exception of the loop of free edges. So there are a couple of loops of free edges. There's one here, and then I believe there's one on the bottom as well. Yep, there's one on the bottom here. So if I click the fill hole function, let's go ahead and click fill hole, and then we'll click fill hole on the bottom. You'll actually see that on the top side, it was able to create the surface, but on the bottom side, it was not. And this is a problem that you'll come into contact when you have kind of an extraneous surface imported with your model. So I'll click OK here, and we'll go to the bottom and we'll try to investigate this a little bit further. So when I'm first looking at this, it kind of just looks like a standard hole. There's not really much going on. It comes to a point which could be alarming, but usually we're able to create surfaces even if they are skinny and narrow. But if I go over here, we can actually see that let me rotate around a little bit. You can actually see that there isn't a free edge on this side. So if there isn't a free edge on this side, it probably means that there's a surface that's connected to this somewhere. So most of the time I really have to rotate around, and it can be a little bit difficult sometimes, but yes, you can see that as I rotate around, so there's actually a little surface on the inside of here. And this can sometimes happen. It doesn't always happen like this. Sometimes actually the surface is extrapolated the opposite way, especially on like fillets. Sometimes you'll actually see that the fillets will just kind of go on the outside instead of where they should. So imagine that the fillet only takes up maybe 90 degrees of the full 360. Sometimes when they import, the fillet will take up the 90 to 360, so 270 degrees instead of the 90 degrees that it should have. So that is quite a common issue, and this is the only way to fix that is to really just delete those surfaces and regenerate the surface. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to go and press the delete function. Not the delete button. The delete button won't do anything for you. You'll have to use the delete function. You can also use the one down here in the auxiliary tools or the repair tool section. All right, and then we'll just find that surface, make sure it highlights in light blue, left click on it to highlight it in dark blue, and then you can press the enter button or you can press done up here at the top right corner. All right, and now if we go over to loops of free edges, we can actually see if we rotate around to that original angle, we can actually see that there is a red edge on this side, which means that this surface can now be generated. If I click fill hole, we'll actually see that happens. So this is kind of like I said, this is a little bit more niche than the other two models, but it is something that happens often enough where it can become problematic if you don't know how to deal with it. So I recommend that you kind of try that a couple of times just to get used to that procedure, just in case that does end up happening for you. Thank you for watching the Moldex3D Advanced Tips and Tricks. Please don't forget to leave a like on the video if you enjoyed the content. If you'd like to suggest a future topic, feel free to let us know down in the comments. And finally, if you want to see more content like this in the future, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel.